Greetings. My name is Larry Walters, and I welcome you to the land-based finance training provided by UN Habitat and the Global Land Tool Network. I am a retired professor of public administration. I have spent the last 15 years of my life focused on the issue of land-based revenue for local governments around the world. It's been my privilege to research and teach this material on 5 different continents in a broader range of audiences, and I welcome the opportunity to share some of the things that I've learned and the insights that I've gained with you today. In the course of this video, I want to first of all talk about why we should focus on land as a revenue base. I then want to talk about some of the overarching requirements that exist for using these kinds of tools. And then I want to touch briefly on the training modules that GLTN and UN Habitat have made available, and then talk about what success would look like as a result of your experience with the training that you're about to go through. The first premise of all of this is that by the year 2050, 2 out of 3 people will live in urban areas around the world. And that means that the growth in our urban areas, particularly those mid-sized cities of around 500,000 population, is going to be increasing, and the pressures on governments are going to continue to increase as well. Whether it be from natural disaster or civil conflicts or just the pressures of having more people living in a reasonably confined area, the demand for services is going to increase significantly. It is already increasing and outstripping the ability of many cities to meet those needs. And that means that there needs to be some independent revenue sources available to local government leaders and managers to be able to meet the needs of those increasing demands. So why focus on land? There are other options available. We could think about a value-added tax. We could think about an income tax. We could think about more transfers from a central government. Why should we think about land? Well, the first reason is that land is immovable. If you put a tax on it, it's still going to be there. The landowners may not be very happy. Their land value may go down slightly, but it's still going to be there. They may say, well, we can't do this anymore. We're going to have to sell the land. Okay, it's still going to be there. Whoever buys it is going to have to do something with it. Land is immovable, and that makes it an ideal source for local governments to use as a revenue base. If you tax a sale, the sales can move to another jurisdiction. If you tax income, people can relocate to another jurisdiction. If you tax the land is still there. Very important reason. Next reason, countries that rely more on land and property taxes tend to have faster economic growth. This has been demonstrated by researchers out of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, out of the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. My own research in local governments within the United States over a period of 40 years suggests that those governments that rely more on taxes tied to land will grow faster economically than other governments. Now, what are the reasons for that? Well, if you think about it, people have an incentive to use their land more productively if they know that it's going to cost them a little bit more in taxes each year. If I hold vacant land and there's no tax on it, there's no cost to me, I can wait for values to increase. But if I know that I have to pay a tax every year, and if that tax is going up a little bit, then it becomes more expensive. So at the margin, we're going to get a bit of a nudge for people to use their land more productively. They'll also use a little bit less land because it's a little more expensive to have land sitting around that you're not using particularly. That means you get more compact urban development. You get more efficient land use. You get better economic growth, better economic outcomes if you tax the land. Third reason, land can provide a very stable revenue resource. In good times, bad times, the land is still there. The tax obligation, if it's designed appropriately, will be buoyant so that it grows slightly as the economy grows, and it's even if the economy shrinks a little bit, you still have a stable revenue source. And that stability is extremely important to provide a solid foundation for local governments. Next reason is it's what we call a benefit tax. Let me explain what I mean by that. It's difficult to charge for some kinds of services. If I sell someone water, I can charge for the water that they use. And that works fine. It's very difficult to charge households for police protection or street lighting. It's difficult to say, here's the benefit that you're receiving, and therefore you have to pay this share of the costs. Because of that difficulty, and because of this other feature that those who have more land also tend to consume more public services, we have this very nice relationship between taxes on land and the benefits that people receive. So it almost becomes a price. It's not perfect by any means, but it almost becomes a price that people pay. If they have more land, they will pay slightly more in taxes, and that tends to correlate with the fact that they're using slightly more services from government. So that's what we mean by a benefit tax. If the amount that you pay is connected to the benefits that you receive, that's a benefit tax. And if the tax is well designed and government is operating effectively, the taxes on land have that effect. Okay. Next reason is that taxing land encourages transparency and accountability. There's no question that people pay attention if you tax the land, and they don't particularly like it. It's often described as one of the most unpopular taxes around the world. And I understand why, because it's so visible. I once had lunch with a professional, very successful real estate developer. He told me, I hate the property tax. Why? All of the other taxes, the income tax, the sales tax, all of the other taxes, he could manage. He could come up with strategies to reduce and minimize what those taxes were. Property tax, you can't get away from it. The land is there, it can be discovered. And because of that visibility, people pay attention to the tax. And that means that if they think the tax is too high in relation to the benefits they're receiving, that benefit principle again, then they're going to be down at City Hall. They're going to be talking to the mayor. They're going to be talking to the local political leaders to say, wait a minute, why do I have to pay so much when the benefits that we're getting are not there? Okay. One of the big reasons that people around the world resist paying taxes and why we see cultures of tax avoidance is because people don't see the connection between the taxes they pay and the benefits that they receive in their neighborhoods, in their communities. And so one of the features of a well-designed land-based tax is that connection is made very explicit and it's very public. Now that means both that you get better government, you also get more responsive citizens, more engaged citizens who are paying attention. So taxing land, if it's well done, in my mind, it improves the quality of local communities, it improves the quality of local governments. That's one of the reasons I really like it. So, if this is such a great idea, why is it that more countries aren't using it? If you look around the world, most countries don't use land-based taxes very effectively. Why would that be if it's such a great idea? Well, there are several reasons for it. There are some limitations and challenges in using this kind of a tax. The first is administrative capacity. It's often the case that land-based taxes and land-based revenue systems require effective and adequate administrative resources in order to use it. It's not like a value-added tax where the tax that you owe is embedded in the price that you pay at the counter at the last purchase. Okay? And the enforcement mechanisms then have to do with auditing along the way. That's actually much more, as difficult as that is, and I don't want to minimize how difficult it is to do that, it's much easier than administering a land-based tax, because now in addition to collecting, we also have to figure out how much the tax should be. And so the administrative layers of figuring out who the taxpayers are, what the values should be, what the tax should be, getting it collected, it's administratively complex, and I don't want to minimize that. And that's one of the challenges local governments often face in trying to use this kind of an approach. Second reason is, it's often the case that the administrative priorities neglect vulnerable populations. If you collect a tax, let's talk about an informal community, for example. Lots of informal housing constructed, maybe shanties, maybe not, but not there legally. The occupants of the land don't own the land. They don't have a legal right to be there. We put a tax on that. People will pay the tax, and we'll talk more about that in the future, but people will pay the tax. But what happens to the revenue then? The populations there are often neglected because of their status in the community. It's often the case that the most vulnerable populations get neglected. And if we have a land-based tax, that gives us revenue to invest in those communities, but it takes the administrative priorities to do that. Another reason that the challenge that we have in doing this is that land and property values for tax purposes are often badly out of date. We may have values on land that are 30 or 40 years out of date. We may not be able to identify what improvements have been put on land, so we're not exactly sure what the tax assessment should be. But again, that gets back to the administrative issues that we talked about, but the valuations have to be accurate in order for the system to be fair. And there are many incentives for people to, at the margin, encourage errors in the assessment of those taxes. And so property values for purposes of taxes are often out of date. Finally, there is taxpayer resistance. As I mentioned before, if you can't establish the connection in people's minds between what they're paying in taxes and the benefits that they receive, we can anticipate that there will be resistance. If you raise the taxes and insist that they pay but don't show them the benefits they get, there will be significant resistance to paying that tax. In instances around the world, we've seen, as we have in Greece and elsewhere, people in the streets complaining about the taxes. Okay? So it's absolutely critical that we anticipate that resistance will be there, both from the extremely wealthy who often hold all the property and from the most vulnerable who have the least means to be able to pay the taxes. We have to anticipate those responses and have a public information campaign that explains what we're doing, why we're doing it, how people will benefit. We can overcome this challenge, but we have to acknowledge that it's there. Okay. So, given those limitations and challenges, how do you bring about change? Because it is absolutely the case that governments around the world, both developed and developing, have successfully used these kinds of techniques and these tools to increase the revenues for local governments. And so the question is, how do you go about doing that? So there are some overarching requirements, and I'd like to talk about just 4 of them at this point. The first one is that you have to have a strong legal framework and a functioning legal institutions. Okay? By that I mean there has to be a legal foundation for what you're trying to do with these instruments. If we're going to tax land every year, that's great, we can do that, it's done all over the world. The legal system has to say that's what we're going to do. If we're going to charge developers for putting in a new development, that's great, it's done all over the world, it's extremely successful. We have to have the legal foundation and the framework for doing that. The other thing we need to have is a court system and a judicial system that supports and understands and enforces those requirements. Okay? This is especially true with property rights. There are 2 schools of thought when we think about property rights. On the one hand, there are those, which comes largely, you see it in developed countries in the industrial West, that sees land and property as an economic commodity. It's just bought and sold in the marketplace, just like a loaf of bread or a shirt off your back, or it's just another economic commodity. That's one way to think about it, but it's not the only way. And increasingly we see out of the European Union and elsewhere in the world the view that no, land and property are fundamental for the achievement of other human rights. Well, if you take that view, that gives you a very different set of policies than if you see as simply another economic commodity. In either case, we can design revenue systems that based on land and property that are productive for local governments. But we have to understand which view we're going to adopt, and we have to accommodate that in our design system. And we have to have a legal framework that recognizes it and legal institutions that identify, support, and defend whichever sense of rights we're going to adopt. Okay? Cultural adaptation is a second major requirement. In my experience, I have seen in many instances around the world, consultants will come in from another culture, another country with a lot of experience and understanding of how it works back home. And they'll come into an entirely new set of conditions and requirements, and they'll recommend, let's do it the way we did it back home. And they try to put that system in place. It's expensive, and it fails. It fails because we haven't adapted to the local conditions. These instruments work well around the world, but they don't always work the same way. And so when we look at an instrument, and you'll, over the course of the training, you'll look at a number of different cases of how some of these instruments work in different contexts, from Latin America to Asia to Africa, which is great. You need that. You need to be able to understand how it works elsewhere. But when it comes to saying, okay, how would we do it right here in our home, right now? What would it take? You have to think about what the differences are, both in terms of history, in terms of culture, in terms of goals and capacities. What are the differences? And you have to adapt those ideas to those local conditions. That's particularly true for land rights, as I've indicated. If you live in a country like Papua New Guinea, where 97% of the land is communally owned, you're going to have a very different revenue system than if you live in Colombia, where the land is mostly privately owned. Okay, so we have different systems. We can make a system work, but we have to adapt to the local conditions. Okay. Third overarching requirement is that the policies and practices have to reflect the realities of land markets. You will often see it referred to that the land-based revenue systems that are based upon the market value of land and property, that's the gold standard. That's what you should be working for. That's the system that you should put in place. Not always true, because in many instances, those markets simply don't exist. Or they may exist for one strata of the market. Say that the middle income and high income properties may have a very active real estate market. But down at the lower income levels, if the market exists, the information on how it's working is simply not available. And in other instances, there aren't enough transactions. People don't buy and sell and trade land with enough frequency to make it the data and the concept of a market relevant. And so, again, whatever the circumstances are, we can design a system that will work in that context, but the design has to fit the reality of how those local markets are working and their level of maturity. Okay. The fourth issue is a capable administration. As I mentioned to you before, land and property tax revenue systems are not necessarily easy to administer. We have to have an adequate number of people, they have to have adequate training, they have to have an adequate budget in order to be able to make the system work fairly, efficiently, and to be productive from a revenue standpoint. Now, there are some international guidelines on what a tax on land and property should cost in relation to the revenue that is collected. But the key point is that land-based finance requires effective administrative structures and capable people. Now, those structures don't all have to exist in the same agency, but they all need to be there someplace, and we need to identify where those capabilities are, and we need to design a system that brings people together and facilitates the operation. Okay. So, with that kind of background, you need to know that GLTN and UN Habitat have put together a set of training modules. And this slide looks at the 7 different modules, the 7 different instruments that are discussed in that training module. There are 2 publications that can be downloaded for free from the GLTN website. There is a reader that talks about each instrument, gives you the history, gives you the literature on it, and also provides cases that describe how those tools work in different settings around the world. There are 21 different cases from 18 different countries, and they give you specific, detailed descriptions of how these tools work. There's also a trainer's guide for those who wish to provide training on these techniques to others that talks about training strategies, tools for each of the instruments that are here. Okay. What will success look like? You're engaged now in considering some of these tools and will over the next several days. What will success look like? If you go away saying, wow, that was really interesting, and that's all, this training will have failed. Success, from my perspective, means not only that you understand the material that's being discussed, but you have a clear vision of what needs to happen in your context to be able to use at least some of these tools. Okay? You need to understand and support a plan of action. So it's one thing to understand, it's another thing to say, okay, if we wanted to do that right here in my hometown, what would we have to do? And then, where's our action plan? What's the plan for making those things happen so that we can do it? And finally, what's my personal responsibility to make it happen? To accomplish the tasks necessary to bring about that change. The success of this training will depend upon your willingness to engage the material, to engage with your colleagues in the room, to identify what needs to happen, come up with a plan, and be committed to bring about that change. So thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for caring enough to come and learn more about these tools and try to understand them. And now I hope you go out and change the world.